Today we are looking at a case from the 1920s, so sit back as we go to the USA. Velma West was born in 1906 in Cleveland, Ohio, to parents Bert and Catherine Van Wert. Her father worked as a travelling salesman, and although away from the house for periods of time, he liked to spoil his daughter. Growing up, Velma was often ill and suffered from various ailments, but by the time she was 19 years old, she was considered a healthy young lady and, like most women her age, entered the employment market. Since the turn of the century, there had been a steady increase in the number of women working, and for many these were exciting times. The 1920s saw the US economy grow substantially, and new industries were established, which meant that by 1925, nearly one half of the world's industrial output was produced in the United States. At the same time, the social landscape was changing, and young women started to frequent the dance halls and jazz clubs that were now very popular with the country's young, energetic workforce. Social barriers were removed, and it became more socially acceptable for women to go out, smoke, and drink. Velma embraced this new way of life and very much liked to spend time socializing and dancing in the Cleveland jazz clubs. She was a very social person, but this had a detrimental effect on her work life, and after a year she was dismissed from her position. She had been working as a clerk in a hardware store, but the owner, a gentleman named Harry Rothman, had become displeased with her as she seemed to be constantly talking to young men instead of concentrating on her work. This may not have mattered to Velma, as during her lunch breaks, she had often visited a local restaurant owned by a 56-year-old man named William Chapman. He had proposed to her, and the couple had planned to marry in the summer of 1926. However, a few weeks before the wedding, Velma attended a picnic in nearby Perry Park, and it was here, as she was looking out onto Lake Erie, that she met a man named Thomas Edward West, affectionately known as Eddie by everyone who knew him. Eddie lived in the small village of Perry, situated about 35 miles from Cleveland, and was a son of the wealthy nursery owner, Thomas B. West, who had come to Ohio from the town of Peterborough in England and established a number of nurseries which provided shrubs and trees to household and commercial establishments all over the United States. Eddie was 4 years older than Velma, having been born in 1902, and soon after meeting, they became a couple. To most people, it seemed that they were a strange match. She was a city girl and a socialite, and he was more at home in the village and was the sort of man who would want to settle down and have a family. However, despite seemingly having nothing in common, Eddie proposed, and after a short engagement, the young, attractive Miss Velma Van Wert became Mrs. Velma West. Eddie was a tall, strong, athletic man who worked for his father in the family business. The couple lived in a house owned by Eddie's parents, which was next door to the house where Eddie's older brother named James lived. It was a nice property, but for Velma it was in the wrong place, as the tranquil life in the small village of Perry, while very idyllic for many, was something that the young, lively Velma soon grew tired of. She missed the jazz clubs and the nightlife in Cleveland. It also became apparent that Velma was looked down upon by some of the other residents of Perry. Although these were changing times, many people considered it inappropriate for a lady to smoke, especially in public, and Velma smoked a lot. She would often be seen in the shops and around the village with a cigarette in her hand. Eddie's parents were very conservative. They considered that the community was very important and were popular amongst all the residents of the village. But Velma found it hard to settle. Eddie introduced her to his friends, but she found the life too quiet and longed for nights out in the city. At first, Eddie tried to oblige with his wife's request to go out in Cleveland, but this was not always possible, as although he was the son of a very wealthy Ohio gentleman, Eddie did not earn much money and was paid by his father as an employee in the business. Eddie preferred that he and Velma socialise with his friends in Perry, but Velma soon became bored and found their social events dull and uninteresting. In the late spring of 1927, a young lady who lived in Cleveland, named Mabel Young, spent some time in Perry. She seemed to share Velma's interests, and the two became great friends. Velma's marriage, however, was not going so well. She often argued with Eddie, who had become frustrated with his wife's seemingly endless desire to spend the weekends dancing and socialising in Cleveland. On at least 2 occasions she left him, returning to her parents' house, only to be persuaded by them to return to her husband and try to make a go of the marriage. Velma listened to her parents and returned to Eddie, but the arguments continued. She continued to arrange for them to go out in Cleveland, and although Eddie would often accompany his wife, it was very apparent that he preferred to stay in Perry. They both had a very contrasting approach to marriage, and Eddie's interpretation of what was an enjoyable evening was very different to his wife's. On the night of the 6th of December 1927, Velma wanted to go to a bridge party in Cleveland, hosted by her good friend Mabel Young. Originally, Eddie had agreed to accompany her, but it was a Tuesday, and after working all day at the nursery, he didn't want to drive the 35 miles to Cleveland. Inevitably, the couple started to argue. Velma had been very much looking forward to the event, and she was adamant that Eddie was not going to prevent her from attending. That evening, Tuesday the 6th of December 1927, Velma drove from Perry to Cleveland alone. She arrived at her friend's house at around 8:30 p.m, and whilst playing bridge, she seemed to be in very good spirits, even interrupting her card game to entertain the guests with her musical talents. She started playing the piano and singing. She spent the night at her friend's house. Then the next morning, she went to see her mother, as they had agreed to go Christmas shopping. Together they visited the shops and department stores in the city. Velma was very particular in what she bought, making sure that she had a present for everyone, including her in-laws, and of course, her husband Eddie. When the two ladies returned to Velma's parents' home, they were quite exhausted from their shopping trip. But when they arrived, they were shocked, as waiting for them outside were 2 Lake County police officers, who gave Velma West the devastating news that her husband Eddie had been attacked by an intruder in his home and was dead. They asked Velma to accompany them back to Perry. The police explained that when Eddie had failed to come to work on Wednesday the 7th of December, his brother James went to look for him. He found Eddie in his bedroom. He had been hit several times with a heavy object. His hands had been tied behind his back, and his body had been covered with bed linen. When Velma arrived in Perry, she was immediately taken to the police station, where she was interviewed by Sheriff Rasmussen. She was very calm and explained how she had planned to go to a function in Cleveland with her husband, but as he was tired after work, he had decided to stay home, so she had taken the car and gone there alone. At this time, Velma was not a suspect in the crime. After all, how could the petite 21-year-old have inflicted the blows onto her husband, who was over 6 feet tall, strong, and very fit? The police, however, found it strange that nothing had been taken from the property. Suddenly, the sheriff was startled when Velma informed him that she had killed her husband. At first, the inspector thought it very hard to believe what the young lady was saying, but Velma explained that she and Eddie had started to argue, as he had not wanted her to go to her friend's bridge party, which she had been so much looking forward to. He then told her that he would not allow her to use the car. She told the inspector that when he said this, something inside her snapped. Earlier that day she had been hanging curtains in the bedroom, so she grabbed the nearby hammer and struck her husband with it. She thought that he was merely unconscious, so bound his hands and covered him with bed linen. She changed her clothes and burned the dress that she had been wearing before calmly taking the car keys and driving herself to Cleveland. She stressed, for she did not actually believe that she had killed her husband. After making her confession, Sheriff Rasmussen charged Velma West with the murder of her husband, Thomas Edward West. The trial of Velma West was scheduled to commence at the courthouse in Painesville, Ohio, in March 1929. The story of the young, pretty Cleveland girl who had killed her husband caused a sensation in the press, who filled their pages with speculative reasons about why she would commit such a crime. Some commented that 21 was the age that most women at the time got married. So although Velma may have felt somewhat trapped in a more rural life than she was used to, marriage was the most normal life for young ladies of her age. But Velma seemed to have embraced the city nightlife more than most other women, and living as a married woman in Perry with her husband, who was more interested in settling down and building a future with his wife, eventually led her to snap and commit a most horrible crime. The trial, however, never took place, as just as the jury were being selected, Velma's defence team reached a plea bargain with the prosecution, and she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Velma West was then sentenced to life in prison at the Marysville, Ohio State Reformatory. However, life didn't always mean life, and Velma knew that after 10 years, she would be eligible for parole. While in prison, she studied courses, including one in stenography, and with her positive attitude and exemplary behaviour, she gained the trust of all the prison officials. At Velma's first parole hearing, she had her application denied, and now 31 years old, she faced more time in the Marysville Penitentiary. Velma, however, didn't plan to stay in prison for the rest of her life, and at about 12:30 a.m. on the 19th of June, 1939, along with 3 other inmates, Velma casually walked out of the prison through a door that led to the prison chapel. Again, Velma West was headline news across America, and pictures of her and the other 3 escapees appeared in most national newspapers. Despite the extensive media coverage and many false sightings of the 4 women, it took almost 40 days before Velma was eventually found in Texas. She had been using an assumed name and working as a waitress in Dallas. Velma was returned to Marysville, where over the following years she wrote music and entertained fellow prisoners by playing the piano and singing. She also attended the chapel and gave lectures to young people about how crime is the wrong path to take. In 1959, she was again eligible to be considered for parole, but she informed the board that she would prefer to stay in prison as she had nowhere to go. Her father had died in 1944, and although her mother and brother were both alive at the time, she did not want to be a burden to them. She may have asked not to be considered for parole, as she knew that her health was failing, and shortly afterwards, on October the 24th, 1959, Velma West died at the age of 53. She was buried at Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Cemetery in Marysville. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case